Hello, everybody. This is Lisa Johnson with Everbridge. I want to welcome you to today's webinar, Active Shooter Preparedness, the 2017 update with Steve Cremando. Thank you so much for joining us today. My name is Lisa Johnson. I'm the Senior Program Manager for Healthcare. I've worked in healthcare communications for over 5 years now, and I've been in Everbridge for a year and a half. And I think one of the reasons why we're here today is the CMS Emergency Preparedness Guidelines. As you know, we are a little more than 2 months away from those guidelines being finalized. One of the things that they use is active shooter drills as one of the drills to use to qualify for CMS. So you should be able to pick up some tips that will help you meet that goal today. And I'd like to introduce Steve Cremando. He is an internationally known consultant and educator specializing in the application of behavioral sciences in homeland and private security, violence prevention, crisis management, and disaster response. He is a certified trauma specialist, a certified police instructor, and holds level 5 certification in homeland security. We have worked with Steve for quite a while now. He is one of our best presenters, and he is a guy who's literally in the thick of it. As events come up, he's often deployed, and we are very lucky to have him here with us today. Welcome, Steve.
We can get started with our slides. And first of all, everyone, thank you very much for taking the time out of your day to join us for this presentation. As Lisa said, and as you can see in the title, we're really talking about updates, and I want to be clear as we start that this is not necessarily an active shooter 101 sort of program. We're going to be making some assumptions that you and your organizations have some level of knowledge and probably, for many of you, a high level of expertise in understanding this sort of problem, having policies, plans, perhaps very advanced exercises. So I know that we have very diverse audiences on our webinars, ranging from fairly new in the cycle of active shooter preparedness to folks who are expert in this. And unfortunately, sometimes people and organizations that have lived through these events themselves. And with that in mind, as I said, we try to find a bit of a middle ground where there's something useful for everybody. But as I said, to do that means that we're starting a little further down the development curve and not necessarily at the 101 or beginner level. So as you see in our agenda, we have actually a number of tasks to work through. I'll be keeping a pretty good operational or pretty good presentation tempo going through the program. As Lisa mentioned, we will have a number of opportunities for questions at the end of the program. So please make notes for yourself or send them in, using the mechanism so we can address your questions as they come up. Having said that, I'd like to jump right in. Lisa already introduced me, so I want to move ourselves ahead. I think most of us are in a place today that when we hear about another active shooter situation, we certainly are saddened by it, but we're probably no longer shocked. When we think about the number of cases that we have around the country in general, not just specific to hospital and healthcare, we know that number has roughly tripled over the years, and there's kind of almost a steady drumbeat of active shooter situations operating in the background. There's a few things, though, that each of these events increasingly reinforces and teaches us. And as I said, one is that there's not a place or type of organization immune from these situations. We know there are different sort of risks in hospitals and healthcare. And I want to focus on that because what we see in the general public and what you see in active shooter situations in other places actually is very different than what we see in hospital and healthcare settings. Not just the venue, not like obviously there's differences between the movie theater, the shopping mall, and the hospital, but actually the motive of the shooter, the nature of the shooting incident, the target, all of those things change very substantially in hospital and healthcare settings. But one of the things that does not change is in the initial phase of the shooting event, what bystanders do. And they could be hospital staff, they could be guests or visitors, they could be both non-clinical and clinical staff in our hospital and healthcare settings. What we do in those first few moments makes a critical difference in how the situation turns out. We're going to refer to that as the response gap, and I'm going to speak about that a little more fully as we go through the program. So any shooting in a hospital environment, and I'm going to make the distinction between an active shooter situation and a shooting incident in just a moment, but any shooting event obviously is a nightmare scenario. I mean, just the nature of hospitals is to be a sanctuary. It's a place where people go to heal, to get well. And the last thing, certainly on any of our minds, that there'll be places of risk, of people being hurt worse or having lives ended through violence in those kind of settings. Hospitals, of course, are soft targets. They're meant to be open environments, places of warmth and caring. So there very often are a lot of places or ways in and out of hospitals. We only screen guests and visitors so well because we want to maintain that sort of ambiance. But they're also target-rich environments. There's a lot of people, and those are staff and patients, visitors, and so forth, as I said. But lastly, from the standpoint of a potential shooter, these are also part of our national critical infrastructure. And when we take a hospital offline, it has cascading effects through our city, through our region, that obviously are very disruptive and very damaging as well. Now, one thing that's very important is we're going to share some key concepts. Some will be familiar, some will be novel to you, that there's not a one best approach or a one-size-fits-all sort of approach to active shooter planning and preparedness for your hospital. A lot of the concepts that we share today or we point out to you in different guidances, you very, very much have to massage and work into your culture and your reality. But one thing that stands true regardless of the culture, regardless of the size and scope of your hospital setting, is probably the very best way to protect people's lives is to get them out and away from the shooter. So in law enforcement, very often we talk about these concepts of time and distance. We want to put space, we want to put barriers, we're going to talk a little bit about cover and concealment. Some of those things are very basic and they'll be familiar to you. But the more we could do to put that time and distance between the shooter and their potential targets, the better we do. Now, I'm going to make recommendations for a few guidances. And regardless of your role, regardless of your job title, I would strongly recommend that these guidance documents are somewhere on your bookshelf. And I'm hoping that a number of these are already on your bookshelf. But if not, we're going to point out in just a few moments the Active Shooter Planning and Response Guide for healthcare settings, the other document incorporating active shooter incident plans into healthcare emergency ops, and we're going to introduce a new one that's new for 2017 as well. But what we're not going to talk very much about is, really each of the different units or each of the different settings. There's not a way for us to do that in a single session today. So as I said, all of the content, it's going to require you thinking it through and modifying. So let's start, with your bookshelf. What's around your desk? I'm not talking about from a safety standpoint, but here from a professional development and an educational standpoint. These two documents serve as bedrock for your foundation of your thinking and your planning. The first I had the privilege of working on with NYPD when Commissioner Kelly was there a few years back. It was one of our first large-scale studies of the active shooter situation. And the first study guide, we had looked actually at 324 cases from the very first kind of active shooter of record, even though there have been shooting events before. The Texas Bell Tower shooter in '66 very often becomes that index point all the way through 2012, and then we actually had to republish this after 2012 because that was such an active year itself. That document goes case by case with a lot of detail about the nature of the event and all the details, but also breaks it up by sector. So that's going to be very useful for you. That's a download, as a PDF. All of these at no cost can be found online. But the more recent document by the FBI, looking at a smaller time frame, 2000 to 2013, and what are the recommendations there? Those are generic to all kinds of settings, but as I said, they form kind of the basis or the foundation of our learning and our thinking in this area. Now, in healthcare and hospital settings, we start to drill down a little deeper, and we go back a few years to 2015, and we look at these documents, active shooter planning and response in healthcare settings. This is a very, very strong document, and one of the things I really enjoy about this document is it starts to go into exercising a little more specifically, and that's critical, and it is so complex in hospitals and healthcares. And then from FEMA, from ASPR, and the FBI, we have this other document, incorporating active shooter into your facilities emergency operations plans, a great guidance for how you interoperate or integrate active shooter into that. And we'll talk a little bit about that. But since then, we actually have a newer document published in January by the Healthcare and Public Health Sector Coordinating Council. This is a very, very strong document, and one of the things I recommend about this is it actually sets a very, very good discussion of post-shooter. And a lot of the webinars that I've had a chance to do with Everbridge, and a lot of the speaking I do around the country is on post-incident, and it's a place that very often we don't give enough attention to. I mean, I understand this, but nationally our attention has been on those like 5 minutes of terror between shots fired and shooter down. And those are critical for life and death. And don't get me wrong, those are critical for survival. But there's a whole lot happening before that first shot is fired, and there's an awful lot that's happening after the shooting is over that can be very, very tricky for hospital administrators and leaders to kind of get right. So one of the things I do like about this document, and remember, if you're looking at this quickly, you do have the capacity to download the archived version or access the archived version of this webinar, several days from now as it's posted. So you will have a chance to go back and look at these documents and look at some of the links as well. But I'd recommend those 5 documents as being on your bookshelf that start to create a body of knowledge for us in understanding the active shooter problem in general and the active shooter problem specific to hospital and healthcare. Now, I made a reference before, and I want to go back to this, which is the distinction between active shooter situations and the shooting incident. By definition, the active shooter is someone who's looking for numbers. So they do not necessarily target specific individuals in most instances. They pick a place. They're picking a venue that gives them access to folks who are, one, there in numbers, and two, in a confined area where they cannot flee effectively. And you can think about non-hospital environments like the Aurora, Colorado movie theater, where essentially it's a shooting gallery, and the victims are lined up in those neat rows, facing forward at the shooter in the dark. So these active shooter events, we know at a behavioral science level, are cold-blooded killings. They're what we refer to as predatory, which means that there's a long planning curve in most instances. If we look at maybe Anders Breivik, or shooter in Oslo, Norway, killing 69 kids after detonating a car bomb in Oslo in that morning of July 22nd, 2011, he tells us in his courtroom testimony he started planning 7 years prior. So these have a very long curve leading up to the event and a very long tail after the event. But these events themselves, they're over very quickly. Today, if we look at the FBI statistics, in those cases where they can ascertain a timeline, about 70% roughly are over in 5 minutes or less. Now, this speaks to everything about your need for planning, for exercising, for communications templates to be in place, because when that first shot goes off, man, there is no time for thinking. This has to be autopilot. You need to be able to roll right into that response very quickly. Now, this is a little different in a shooting incident. And I have to tell you here that when we look at the big numbers of hospital shootings, most tend to be shooting incidents rather than active shooter events. And the shooting incident tends to be much more targeted. It can be, that single shot fired or 1 or 2 shots fired, but it is not someone who's looking for big numbers of victims. And these are not necessarily cold-blooded killers. They tend to be what we refer to as affective, as opposed to predatory violence, hot-blooded killing rather than cold-blooded killing. And in these instances, the individual tends to be looking for specific people, right? So this is targeted, and it is not someone looking for numbers per se. Now, can other people get caught up in the crossfire? Yes. Can it end up with many casualties? Sure, it can, but the motive and the method of the shooting is very different. You know, and when we think about this, in general, nationally, internationally, and we think about it specific to our sector of hospital and healthcare, as I said, you don't have to look far into the news or, you know, the newspapers to see that these are going on an ongoing basis, and they go on around the country. But when you really study these cases, regardless of where they've occurred, they tend to be much more targeted. The individual comes back looking for people, staff, others who in some way they feel have hurt them, have wronged them, and they're settling a grudge, or in their mind feel justified in the shooting, but they're not necessarily looking for big numbers. Now, I said I was going to point out some new research to you, and I want to bring this up early. This is actually pretty new, just over the last weeks. This survey of public health and healthcare professionals on active shooter events in hospitals. This is very specific, targeted research published in the Journal of the American College of Surgeons just in 2007, just again several weeks ago. And a few things changed, because one of the big problems we always have in hospitals and healthcare is kind of the patient-first dilemma, right? Like, what does staff do? Do we run and abandon patients? Do we stick with patients come hell or high water? And, you know, because we're always going to put patient first, you know, what's the thinking? And a lot of hospitals have adopted this posture that staff should do everything reasonably possible to protect their patients, but at some point it may be important for the staff to move into, you know, really self-preservation, getting themselves to safety so they are available to double back and assist anyone who's been injured. So there's a lot of different thinking, and a lot of this comes down to personal choice and your own ethics and your own decision, but also to that environment. But look at this in the study. One of the things that were, you know, few things that floated to the top of this research, and I really recommend you take a look at this study, was the vast majority of doctors and healthcare workers have a very strong belief that there can be, you know, an active shooter event in their hospital environment. So there doesn't seem to be a lot of people operating with their head in the sand about this. But it's a little bit different when you look at the public versus professionals, and these are some of the numbers. 18% of the public versus nearly double that number, 32% of healthcare professionals thought the odds of that active shooter situation were pretty high. You know, were high or very high in the study. So people working in these environments, they get this. When we start to come back to that issue of patient dilemma, then some of the other things that came out of this research was almost like a sliding scale, where healthcare workers said, you know, it kind of depends. And the more vulnerable the patient, the less ambulatory the patient, the more staff thought that they needed to stick with the patient, be there to protect them in these different settings, whether they were the OR and ICU, people on vents, you know, different kind of scenarios. But those numbers started to, you know, really substantially drop as you got to patients who are more ambulatory, where there was a sense like, hey, the patient can also be involved in their own self-protection, their own survival. They could run as well. So it started to change. And there's kind of an understandable aspect to this and kind of a common sense aspect that's really interesting now. It's borne out in this very robust kind of research. This is, to me, one of the most important findings, and I think, again, it makes really good sense, which is the very last bullet point here. 92% of healthcare professionals thought that docs and nurses should have a personal choice about whether to try to save a patient's lives in an active shooter situation, or they should get themselves out of there in the interest of survival. So what we know is, as you're making plans, policies, procedures, and exercises, you want to do this with your staff and not to your staff. Those docs, those nurses, those technicians, everyone in your hospital environment, they need to have a voice and understand the decisions we're making they are telling us some very important things in this research. Now, also interesting in the research, and this is out of the same study, were something else that I've been focused on for a long time, and I want to reinforce here today in our webinar. And this is the idea that there are other types of workplace violence that we need to be concerned about, and I'm going to refer to them later as type 1 and type 5, and I'll clarify those terms further if you're not familiar with them, that have to do with other kinds of violence that are not necessarily active shooter. People can get hurt, shot, and killed in these instances, but they're not active shooter events. They're driven by other motives. Type 1 is criminal intent, so you see someone who says, hey, the pharmacy is a really interesting target for a robbery for someone seeking meds, narcotics and such. And when we think about what we refer to as type 4 violence, that's domestic violence that comes to work, or type 5 violence, which is ideologically driven violence. And although it wasn't a hospital per se, if you think of November 2015 and the shooting at the Planned Parenthood clinic in Colorado Springs, that was ideologically motivated. So the shooter targets healthcare staff because of what they do and what they represent. So you cannot discount the risk. This is right out of the study. You cannot discount the risk of these other types of violence that may drive shootings in hospitals. When we look at this study now about a year ago from HSS, one of the things that really jumped out, and we know this from OSHA statistics as well, is healthcare and hospital workers are dramatically more likely to be involved in workplace violence than almost any other job. The ones that compare to this, they're police and corrections officers. But the violence that's encountered by those groups, healthcare, law enforcement, corrections, we refer to as type 2. And that's violence that's perpetrated by someone we know as a patient, a client, a customer during the routine delivery of our services. Now, the reason that this should jump out at you is although our discussion today is about active shooter events are the most statistically rare but most devastating form of workplace violence in any setting, including the hospital. In the hospital, the big part of the iceberg of violence, that part that we're not speaking about much today, are patient assaults. That's where most of the violence comes from. It's people who assault staff in that caregiving relationship. It's not necessarily the active shooter. And you could look at how much smaller the slices of the pie are when we talk about the other kinds of violence. So very important that your active shooter plans are integrated with all other types of workplace violence for your setting, including that huge piece of type 2 violence. Don't make that something else. Don't say, we have very good plans and policies for preventing patient-to-staff violence. Oh, and over here, a whole different thing, we have our active shooter plan. This exists on a continuum. They are all different manifestations of workplace violence, with the active shooter being the most dramatic, obviously, and the most catastrophic in some instances. Now, when we think about this, one of the things we know, and we've been talking about this in our circles for a long time, OSHA seems to be on a pretty steady trajectory to passing the first real substantial regulation about workplace violence, and it looks like it's going to be targeted at healthcare and human service organizations where the numbers are so big. OSHA has always seen workplace violence as falling under the general duty clause. The idea that employers have an obligation to provide that safe and hazard-free environment for us. But knowing that the numbers are so high in healthcare, human services, social services, we're very likely to see sometime soon, what may be the first real reg or law that kind of, gets the ball rolling. And of course, that will trickle down to all the other certifying and regulatory agencies and accreditation agencies and so forth, if that comes to be. So understand that OSHA sees this as very, very substantial. Now, there's a lot of good writing. And there's been a great, great studies out from Hopkins, great studies out from Brown, some of the studies done by OSHA and the Bureau of Labor Statistics that give us some ideas about, what are we really looking at in hospital shootings and how do they differ from other shootings. The first thing we know is compared to mass shootings in other venues, these are still fairly rare. They're dramatic. They're very newsworthy because, as I said, hospitals are seen to be sanctuaries, and it's just a wrongness to it when someone does commit a shooting in a hospital or healthcare setting. But compared to other shootings, they're still fairly statistically rare. The perpetrator, 91% male. So for most of this presentation, as I talk about the shooter, I'm going to refer to him in the male gender. Now that's a little bit different because think about this. When we look at the FBI study, when we look at especially the NYPD study, we're talking about 96% male. So there's a little bit variance. There's a little more likelihood of a female shooter in the hospital. Where in the hospital becomes important. The ER is one of the biggest risks. There's some good research that really asks the question, are hospital emergency departments the most dangerous places to work in the U.S.? In some ways, the answer is yes, they are. So emergency departments, 29%. The parking lot in and around the facilities and patient rooms, we'll talk about how that is different. But guess what, folks? None of those tend to be classic active shooter events. So we have to go back and make this distinction. What's the difference between a shooting incident and an active shooter event? And the primary difference is, the relationship to the victim, the motivation of the shooting, and the person who's looking for specific targets as opposed to just looking for numbers of victims. The number of hospital-based shootings, especially those related to homicides, has been ticking up. You have to also appreciate how many of these end with suicide. The perpetrator of the shooting, they tend to be the most likely casualties of these events. And Brown, for example, went a little bit further and tried to look at this by geographic region. And you can see with me how they divvied this up. In the South, unfortunately, really held the biggest lion's share of those shooting events, with the Northeast having the least. Now, when we think about this, a lot of the research, and not just any one study, kind of identifies a number of facilitating factors, and those are the things that are precipitants, things that are kind of fanning the flames. What's different in healthcare settings as opposed to other places that kind of may drive that sort of angry, hostile, impulsive, or violent sort of response? And there's a number of things we all see, both as consumers and deliverers of healthcare. And that may be things like hospital wait times, additional numbers of behavioral health clients. Let me be very clear. The research here tells us over and over, individuals with mental health diagnoses are no more likely to be violent than the average person. We have to be clear with that. But violence in that population increases when those individuals may be non-compliant with medication and treatment and get involved with substance abuse. That's kind of a triangle you need to think about. Well, guess what? That's what brings that client to the hospital, is they've stopped their meds or there's other sorts of problems. So it is not just someone with a mental health condition. It is those things clustering together that in the emergency department or psych emergency department may reach risk. Transport of jail patients. The way we're building our hospitals to be more open floor plans, to have a warmer feeling. Certainly depending on your community, and none are immune from this, the potential spillover of gang activity into the hospital. If a gang member has been shot and transported, there's been numerous examples of people following him in to try to finish the job. Prevalence of firearms we'll talk about, but something that really is important is staff's awareness and staff's compliance with our own sort of policies and procedures. Lastly on the list is staff often not recognizing the pre-incident indicators of someone who's on a pathway to violence, and that's a whole nother discussion. But I want to look at motive for a moment. I did talk about gender. We talked just a little bit about age here. Those males tend to be in the 18 to 80. We have had shooters younger. We have had shooters older. But look at the motives. Grudge, 27%. It's targeted. the shooter feels someone in that hospital has hurt them or their family in some way, and they're coming back with a sense of vengeance. They're coming back with a sense of being justified that this needs to happen. What does that mean to us? It means we know this person already, and we know they're upset and they're angry. Motive for suicide is very high, whether it's suicide by cop, suicide in the hospital. But this is important, and when you think about the number that shootings that happen in patient rooms, a substantial number of those are mercy killings, in which a loved one comes into that hospital armed with the intention of ending the pain and suffering of a terminally ill loved one. That also ends most often with the person taking their own life. So it's a kind of a murder-suicide scenario. Escaped attempt of a prisoner. This is part of why the emergency department is overrepresented in some of these statistics. A lot of these do occur with that prisoner somehow getting the weapon from an officer or security guard at the emergency room level. Larger societal violence, as I said, that spills into our community, and then that mental health component. And again, always be careful. We don't want to generalize or add to the stigma around mental health. So you heard me say clearly, it is not all individuals with mental health conditions. It is certainly some. The majority of shooting events in hospitals had only one victim. And in most instances, it actually is the perpetrator, because we know the suicides are so highly represented here. But you do see patients, you see staff, you see docs, you see all other kinds of folks mixed in there. What does this start to say to you? If nothing else, it says to you, hospital-based shooting events are different than any other kind. And you can take the guidance I referenced in the beginning from the FBI, from Homeland Security, from NYPD. They're the good foundation to our discussion, but then you have to start drilling down into what's different about hospitals. If you look at this slide with me very quickly, most shooters in hospitals, shootings arise out of a personal relationship, current or estranged relationships, so that's what we referred to before as type 4, domestic violence that spills into the workplace, current and former patients, and then there's a smaller section that are fairly random. But look at that pie chart with me. In non-hospital shootings, and this is an NYPD graphic, a quarter, 26% of all the victims in these shootings had absolutely no relationship, of active shootings in the general community, had no relationship with the shooter, random victim. Now, just a quick mention, you also can't take terrorism out of the equation because of the same vulnerabilities. Target-rich environments that would disrupt the critical infrastructure of the region. If we look big picture at this one study, goes back a few years now, specifically looking at terrorist attacks against hospitals, and this is international. You see about 100 attacks in 43 countries. So this is part of our concern, and we're going to address that when we talk more about type 5 violence in just a few moments. So bottom line, to close out this section, we understand that there's important information in the general environment that you can take and start to extrapolate, but you also need to be looking at what are the things so unique to hospitals, and this could be about the facility, and it could be about our work. It could be special parts of the hospital, like forensic units or VIP units or behavioral health units that have different risks. If we have prisoners transported, guess what? Very often there's an armed officer. If we have high-level VIPs or dignitaries, they may be at the hospital with their own security details, and those people may be armed as well. All those change the risk equation. Where we are in the hospital, again, changes our risk equation. When you're thinking active shooter risk and violence potential, you cannot paint your hospital with one broad brush. You actually do need to drill down and look how the risks change from area to area or unit to unit. For example, we talk about the emergency department, and here back in February from the emergency medicine news, this special report that essentially asked that question: are emergency departments the most dangerous places? And the answer was essentially, yeah, outside law enforcement and corrections, this is probably one of the most dangerous places we could be when we think about assault rates. But you have to remember that not all assaults are weapon assaults, not are all guns, and not are all active shooters. We talk about other special places like your MRI suite. What's the MRI? It's an incredibly huge magnet. That's important to the officer who walks in with a firearm on his or her hip, because that's going to rip it away from them. And we have had stories around the country of that weapon being pulled from an officer's holster or hand, hitting the machine and discharging. So we do need to think in depth, because as you start to plan, as you start to exercise, those plans and exercises do need to be specific, very specific. So we start to talk about that a little more. Remember, as I said earlier, we want you to view active shooter on the overall continuum of workplace violence. Not all violence involves weapons. In fact, the vast majority of workplace violence that occurs in the U.S., it doesn't involve a weapon. It involves, if there is a weapon, it's hands and feet, right? And if we get to that level of gun violence, weapons involved, it still is more likely to be a shooting incident with a very limited number of targeted victims, as opposed to the catastrophic active event, which it's random victim selection and the person has just picked a target. If you're not familiar, I'm going to move through this very quickly. OSHA recognizes 4 general types of workplace violence, and they have for decades. I mentioned earlier type 1. 85% of workplace homicides occur in this category. We have no pre-existing relationship with the perpetrator. He has targeted your facility for a place for a robbery, a theft, trespassing, because there's something of value. And in the commission of that sort of property crime, if weapons involved, people can and do get hurt. They can and do get killed. That's a huge part of the statistics in workplace, huge part of the shooting incidents we see around the country. What we are overrepresented in hospitals and healthcare is type 2. And I've already built that case, so I'm not going to beat that drum much more. But it's when we know the person is a patient or a customer, and that's such a significant number of assaults to staff. What we do see, but not, it doesn't get discussed in the same way sometimes, is the worker-to-worker, and we have had these cases around the country in which it is a current or former, and those are important distinctions, current and former employee in any level of healthcare occupation. From housekeeping to executives to physicians. And that represents about 7% of workplace homicides across the U.S. But very tricky, and healthcare facilities do have to be concerned about this, because very often they have a predominantly female workforce, is type 4, which is intimate partner violence. As I said, that is domestic violence or intimate partner violence that follows the person from home to work. The greatest vulnerability, she leaves him. It's a violent, abusive relationship at home. She leaves, he doesn't know where she's gone. She's staying at a shelter, friends or family, but he does know where to find her on her shift. And that's probably why some of these shootings have occurred, so many have occurred in parking lots, because that's such a dangerous point of transition when she is going from her vehicle or however she gets to work to the building. So there's a lot of things specific. But I did want to mention, as I said, type 5 violence, which we cannot take off the table, and the reports back this up. I already have used the example of the Colorado Springs Planned Parenthood shooting. This is when an extremist, and think about it, this could be animal rights extremists, it could be an extremist group or individual who opposes some sort of research your facility is doing, or some kind of treatment or test your facility does. But here, they have not picked specific people in most instances. You're targeting your organization. So this is ideological violence. Think about this, ideological violence is the intersection of terrorism and workplace violence. So we are vulnerable. And I advocate strongly for building all of those into your approach to workplace violence, because as you think about workplace violence recognition and prevention, you do yourself, your facility, and your workforce a favor by including all of these, so people are looking for the preeminent indicators of all kinds of violence, not just one or the other. So in my world, what we've done over time is started to transition away from just the moment of terror, right? Those 5 brief moments of terror, from shots fired to shooter down, to a more expansive model we refer to as stop the killing, stop the dying, and stop the crying. And this all goes back to something I said earlier, which was about, in that response gap between the shots fired and the police arrived, that's so critical. As I said, the vast majority of people die in those first minutes. Law enforcement actually counts on bystanders playing a critical role. So a real important training question for you is your staff ready? And then the next question is, ready to do what? There has been a fairly robust national discussion about changing some of our models. Now, I am not advocating for one model over the other. Run, hide, fight, over Alice, over alert, over other models. This really is subject to your organization studying them all and coming to your own decision. But if we take something like run, hide, fight, the original model from Homeland Security essentially said this: run if you can, hide if you can't, but fight if you must. But fight should only be a last resort. If you think about an event like the Pulse nightclub in Orlando, 1 shooter, 300 patrons in the club, might there have been an opportunity? And I'm not being a Monday morning quarterback. I'm not criticizing those in the club. But in certain scenarios, depending on your proximity to the shooter and other circumstances, your best first option might be fight. Your best first option might be hide, and not necessarily run. So what you see represented by the graphic on the lower tier of the slide is that we still teach run, hide, fight, or whatever your variables are. We still teach them as the correct options, but not in a linear and sequential way. We want people to use their judgment in the moment and pick whichever one of these options makes the most sense based on the totality of the circumstance and go for it. But depending, again, as I said, on your proximity to the shooter, hide or fight may be your best first option and not your last option. Now, I understand this is probably very small print on your computer screens. Remember, you can go back to these slides when they're archived. But this is a study done by Pete Blair in Texas, really fascinating work that he and his group do. The vertical line up the center is dividing between, before and after the police arrived. This is an N of 83 cases to the left of the screen. That is 40 cases to the right of the screen. That's 43 cases. Please look to the left of the screen. Out of those 40 cases before the police arrived, 16 were stopped by bystanders. That's about 40%. So what we know from the research, and of course from anecdotal evidence, is that people can and do stop armed shooters even if we're not armed ourselves. And we understand how critical it is, because once these shootings begin, on average, another person is shot every 15 seconds. And what people are dying from is they're dying from bleeding out. Okay, so the last thing I was saying, folks, I apologize for that before, was please get familiar with this big national campaign from Homeland Security called Stop the Bleed. What this is teaching civilians, not just medical staff, not just clinical staff, not just EMS, is the very basics of what we refer to as BCON, which is bleeding control. What to do in those moments before others or trained can go hands-on. That will be critical in saving lives. So that's what I mean. There's two components we've touched on so far. Stop the killing is whatever variant of run, hide, fight you use. How do people safely get away from the shooter or take on the shooter? Stopping the dying is bleeding control, and we really push for people to get knowledgeable and get skilled on this. And lastly, stop the crying. I do not mean, and I don't want to be misunderstood, as people thinking, well, how could you say that someone shouldn't cry in the wake of this? Of course you should, man. These are horrible, tragic events. I'm speaking about in the moment of terror. If you have seen the video, Run, Hide, Fight from the Houston Mayor's office, you may recognize this photograph. This is Susie Red Sweater. And in the video, Susie is freaking out. And a lot of times when we show the video, people look and say, man, someone clobber Susie. Someone's got to make her stop, because she's going to give away our location to the shooter. She's going to get us killed. What do we do during the moment? Well, psychological first aid is a skill set intended for the 0 to 48 hours of the event. 0 hour means now. And look at the bottom bullet here. Psychological first aid is a skill set to limit the stress and negative behaviors to reduce fear and arousal. It is not counseling. It's an every person's skill set, just like basic medical first aid. We should all have under our belts some idea of bleeding control and some idea of basic psychological first aid. And as I said in my opening statements, there is no better way to save lives and foil the shooter than to take away their targets. One of the best ways to do this is through rapid communication, telling people there's an incident, what kind of incident, where it is, what to do, and doing that in plain language. Now, you also heard about how quickly these events unfold. That means that you have to have your communication templates, you need to have your communication technologies, your mass notification tools at your fingertips. There will be no time for thinking and no time for innovation. So prepare your message in advance, train your staff how to use these tools, have them understand what kind of messages you'll have, and also make sure you're not creating those messages in a vacuum. You're processing them with your HR, with your legal, with others. All across the spectrum of authorities today, there's a push to move away from codes. Because while staff may understand the code if you call it out on the PA system, visitors, guests, vendors may not. So very plain language, give people information so they could take action, and that puts you in a much, much better position. What is happening, what to do, what they'll hear next, and make sure that message goes out in multiple channels, SMS, voice, email, every way that we could push it out. We have to make sure people get that message, and you're going to need to keep those communications going long after the shooter is down, starting with all clear and for the days and sometimes for the weeks to come. So to wrap up my section, and Elisa has a few things to share with you, hopefully leave time for a few questions and comments. Understand the difference and the complexity of these compared to shooting events in other settings. We talked about how targeted they are, how they're different, and this means that you really should be planning and you really should be exercising for your reality, the thing that's most likely to happen. So Lisa, I'll let you take back over, and again, please jump in, and then we'll take some questions at the end.
Hi, Steve. Thank you so much. Really, really appreciate. I know we've covered this topic before, but you always update it with the latest information. Just to let you know, you've got at least 4 compliments on the content today and how well you put it together. So if you do have any questions, now is the time. I'm just going to be covering a couple of quick points, and then we'll get right into the Q&A. And one of the things that I did want to cover today is what happens when a crisis happens, what exactly do you need? You need to know where your people are. You need to know who's on hand, who can help. You need to know what resources you have. Everything from facilities to medical supplies all need to be part of the overall equation for your plans. You need to know what's happening, and you need to be able to inform people. So that picture that just popped up is our dashboard where you can send out a message and see who has responded, who needs help. You can escalate tasks, which is very important. And the last 2 pictures sort of talk about the community and outside of the hospital walls, the healthcare facility, who are you going to be working with? Is it going to be local responders outside? And then the last slide there with the microphones, and they can certainly tell you with Hurricane Harvey and Hurricane Irma, you're going to need to talk to the press. If there is an active shooter situation, the press is going to be there sometimes almost as fast as the police. So, so how are you going to handle that when it happens to you in your facility? Everbridge can help you in several different ways. We can help you run a command center like we're doing here in Austin, Texas. We are not only available to implement on a desktop, we can also be implemented mobily. We did have an incident where a gentleman was on vacation and was in a canoe and ran an entire incident while he was in his canoe. So we can really execute from anywhere. We do help you with that local community connection, and that is really important with first responders when you have to work with them. Obviously, in the case of an active shooter, you're going to be working extensively with police, but also local government officials as well will be involved. And then the greater community, the people that might be affected, would you have to evacuate, or is there a pandemic, or how are you going to talk and communicate with them? We do want to let everybody know that we have a library of resources on active shooter. We have several webinars, we have several white papers. Steve and I are actually planning a white paper in the next few weeks that'll cover what to do after an active shooter incident, which is also critically important. And we do have a test facility, Everbridge General Hospital. If anyone is interested, you can go inside and see in real time how we execute an incident. And we do have templates for active shooter so that you can very quickly reach out to the people who need to know what's going on. Okay, with that, I'm going to bring it back to Steve, and our first question, it actually came in before the webinar, and can you address a little bit differences with long-term care facilities such as nursing care, assisted living, that sort of thing? Are there differences people should think about?
Well, one of the key differences, Lisa, is what I spoke about earlier. In longer-term care facilities, most of the shootings that we have we have looked at have been those mercy killing sort of things, or they've come out of a grudge in which they feel that staff has mistreated their loved ones, the person's not getting the right attention, or they've been abused in some way. There's been only one that we know of that was more of a classic active shooter in which the person had no real relationship with either the facility or residents or staff, and seem to have picked that. So, it's a funny thing. If you have any physicians online, one of the things they say to docs, in training and residency, in learning to diagnose things, is listen, if you hear hoofbeats, think horses, not zebras. Think about the more common thing, not the exotic thing. And the more common thing, when we do see violence in those facilities, especially this sort of violence, would be from someone we know as the family member of a loved one, a spouse perhaps, or partner of a loved one in the facility. So you need to be thinking about that, which means early recognition becomes one of your best defense strategies. Problem resolution, when you know you have a disgruntled a resident or their family members unhappy, how do you start recognizing violence prevention or violence potential and pre-incident indicators in that situation? The other thing, too, is you have to think that those facilities tend to be less soft. There usually are main doors. There's not as many entrances into the facilities. You usually go past, one desk. And there's other opportunities then to maybe interdict or intercept someone. So front of house personnel, whether it's security or receptionists, they take on a greater role in this kind of situation than maybe in larger facilities or other kind of facilities. So those are just a few thoughts.
Thank you very much. And then a question about the run, hide, fight. Does the Joint Commission or CMS, either one, have a stance on run, hide, fight? And the person is from Children's Hospital in LA. He says he gets asked this question on a regular basis.
I get asked it occasionally, and I still do not have perfect clarity on that. I do not know that the accreditors have come down to endorse only one. I will tell you from a litigation standpoint, after the fact, and folks, I hate to be this cold and this blunt about it, but in shooting events, every bullet comes with a lawyer attached. There will be litigation when there are shots fired in your facility, and questions come up quickly. Did you have plans in place? How were people trained? What were they trained in? And the thing that seems to be more important, and I think this is kind of what I've been interpreted or able to interpret from the Joint Commission and other regulators, is it's important to have a model to train people and saturate that training through the organization, but some of the models seem to lend themselves to be a little more perhaps streamlined or a little more applicable to hospital healthcare. I think when I was first, I guess, looking into that question, it seemed like the Joint Commission and others were going to run, hide, fight almost by default because they were not necessarily as familiar, perhaps, or have seen as many other facilities using the alternate models like Alice Alert and so forth. So my answer is I'm not dead sure either, and maybe some others are, but I think that they speak most often about run, hide, fight, but I don't know if that can be interpreted as an outright endorsement of that model over others.
And Steve, if I could add on to what you're saying, I actually have a call planned in the next week or so with the Joint Commission, so I will ask them and see what kind of a response I get, and I'll be happy to pass that information along when if and when I get a clear answer from them. It's a very good question, though. Thank you for bringing it up. I have another question coming in, and there's a red card and a green card system, which is also used in identifying locked spaces for people to lock down in. It comes from a school system that sort of developed that. Are you familiar with it, and do you recommend it as an option in the healthcare setting?
You know, the system, it was developed for schools, and believe it or not, there's a little bit of controversy around it. Green card means good. So we're using this to communicate with law enforcement as they come, in on the response. You all know that law enforcement has been trained to move right past the wounded and continue to move towards trying to find and neutralize the shooter. So what the green card, red card system was intended to do was to either put in a window or slip under the door or in some way communicate with incoming responders that either things were good enough in that classroom or that shelter room that law enforcement could keep on moving, or a red card was there's a problem, we need help. And that problem can range from the bad guys in here to we have wounded in here. Now, the controversy arises around the fact that if you slip that under the door, you post it in some way, might you be alerting the shooter to the fact that people are actually sheltered in that room? And, part of this is, depending on the shooter's motive and their knowledge, could that work against you? Remember that some shooters are current and former employees, so they will also know the system. And that's a thing we can't get away from. If you identify safe rooms or safe signals like red card, green card, in a certain number of situations, you will have people who know of the system for some reason, and it starts to work against you. So red card, green card, to me, it does make good sense in the school system. I am not sure, I am not confident it makes quite the same sense in the hospital setting or other care facilities. It really, there's a two-edged, sword nature to the red card, green card methodology, if that makes sense.
Yes, thank you so much for bringing that up. I appreciate you sharing the possible issues that could happen. We have time for one more question, and I have to say it's a great question. If you could build a building from scratch, a new hospital, what safety precautions would you build into the architecture?
Oh boy! Well, lots of physical security in terms of access points and things of this nature. I'd probably make it less of the kind of the tendency right now to have lots of open areas, lots of glass areas that make that make things bright and light and feel open and clean, and really start thinking a little bit more about cover and concealment and escape routes and things of this nature. Now, this obviously is a tricky question because there's a balance point in which you start to build, whether it's a school or a hospital or anything, it starts to feel like a fortress and it starts to feel like something different. So the model, rather than give you an idea of architectural design, I'd rather introduce to you a concept. And if you're not familiar, the concept is referred to as red team or red teaming. A red team exercise is you're working with consultants, and I wouldn't necessarily do this yourself. I would actually go find, and I'm not going to recommend one over the other or even recommend ourselves, but find consultants that can bring a red team in and see, how they would penetrate the facility. Now, in your question, if you're building this from scratch, these are also people that could sit down and consult with you and say, hey, listen, from the bad guy perspective, here are different places where your architecture is working against you. It's making you more vulnerable. Here are places where your designs and your approach is making great sense in terms of protecting staff and patients. Here's places where you've gone over the line and it's starting to feel like a prison and not like a hospital. But there is not one, I don't have at least, one recommendation to say, oh, do this. If I did, it would bring in outside consultants early in your design process and look from the floor plans up or have the discussion even before you go to a drawing phase and drawing out those floor plans and start talking to people about those concerns. It's going to vary. You need to talk exactly about the nature of your facility because the nature of shooting and other risks is going to change. But you also have to build those same concepts around an all hazards approach. You need to be thinking about more than just the shooter risk, because some of the things that you would build for only shooter risks, they're going to be a problem to you in other kinds of emergencies. So bring in outside voices on that and work as a team with them so you're getting your voice heard and you're getting that red cell mindset of someone who can, in an educated way, look at it from the bad guy standpoint.
Great, Steve. Thank you so much. My name is Lisa Johnson. I am with Everbridge. Steve, thank you again so much for your information, and we will see you all in just a few weeks. Thank you.